That's what I was also telling Carolyn. I was like,
joining us on behalf of William Daroff, Malcolm Hoenlein, Diane Loeb, and myself. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which is off the record, as we are here to honor Israel's extraordinary ambassador to the U.S., Ron Dermer. Well, Ron, this is a bittersweet occasion because while we're grateful for your outstanding service in the last number of years, and we look forward to your bright future, Bezrat Hashem, we're really sorry to see you go. Indeed, it's been one of the highlights of my term as chairman of the conference to have been here at the time that you have served as Israel's chief representative to the US. Your achievements have been many and sometimes in the news and more often behind the scenes, and you epitomize the best that Israel has to offer. And you made us all feel like proud parents and proud Zionists. Above all, you've been a symbol of strength and a beacon of clarity. As we know, Israel has an epic arsenal of assets designed to face each of its multitude of challenges. So whether it's the IDF, the Israeli Air Force, the Mossad, the Cyber Command, Israel fields a world-beating team. And part of that arsenal has been a world-class ambassador to the US and you, Ron. Watching Tom Brady against Drew Brees the other night, as a couple of guys in their 40s still at the top of their game, I thought of you. Because I happen to know that you can throw a perfect spiral farther than either one of those guys. But in all seriousness, if the IDF is who one would want to bring with you to a fight, it's Ron Dermer who you'd want to bring to a debate. I'll always remember the dinners I've had at your home when in Washington with Rhoda and your wonderful family. I never understood how you could pass up all that delicious food for that Daroff stuff, but never mind that. Quite literally, 4 to 5 hours went by in about a minute as you gave a masterclass in Israel advocacy. No one can hone an argument better than you, and I always came away with a whole new array of talking points, not to mention exhaustion. Ron, you're the quintessential ambassador, so much so that we've decided from this day forward, we will refer to Israel's ambassador to the US as Israel's ambassadormer to the USA. Now, we've prepared a presentation of some special guests in your honor on this special day. So Rachel, take it away.
I came to Washington in 1982 to serve as Ambassador Misha Aarons's deputy chief of mission. So I think I know something about the operation of Israel's embassies and the things that ambassadors do, are supposed to do, and don't do. And I can tell you unequivocally that among some extraordinary people who served in that post, none has been better than Ron Dermer. See, I'm choosing my words carefully because I think he's been an extraordinary ambassador. What he did for Israel, what he did for the Israel-American alliance, what he did for all of us is something that is not widely known, at least not in Israel. Ron must be the first Israeli ambassador to the US who's given perhaps 1 or 2 interviews at most throughout his long tenure in Washington to the Israeli press. He was Israel's ambassador to the United States, not the Israeli ambassador in Washington to Israel, which is something that he never forgot. He fought for Israel's interests, whether it be on questions like Iran that are terrifically important for our future, our survival, whether it is to bring Jonathan Pollard home, and the hundreds of conversations that he had with him, whether it's the peace treaties that have changed history. Ron has been a crucial and central figure in all these efforts. and so many others. I cannot begin to list them. They're truly innumerable. And I think all of you know this because you know that Ron sticks to the point, gets to the point. He reminds me of Sergeant Joe Friday. Remember him? Just the facts? No. Just the facts. You begin with that, but then the spirit, the sense of mission, the sense of deep commitment to our values and to our future. And I think it's been an extraordinary privilege for all of you and for us to have him as our representative in the most important country in the world. There is depth to Ron, there's humor, there's a wonderful family with endless kids being added all the time, and all of them are as gifted as their parents. But I think that Ron has left an indelible imprint on Israeli diplomacy, on these defining years in Israel's history. I can't believe that it is his youthful age he's finished contributing to our country and our people. I welcome him home when he comes back to Jerusalem, and I'm sure we'll find a way to continue to use his enormous talents for the future of our people and our state, and for the American-Israel Alliance. Ron, thank you. Thank you on behalf of all of us. You've been extraordinary.
Ron, I can't believe you're leaving us. But I know this is not a farewell. This is just a temporary goodbye because wherever you end up, I know we're going to run into each other again. And like you've said before, at least you can go back home now with a huge accomplishment under your belt. An accomplishment that's not just good for our two countries, but everybody in our part of the world. I know the Abraham Accords will change the dynamics and the trajectory of the region, and you are partly responsible for that. I look forward to working with you and seeing you and continuing our friendship wherever you end up. You always have a friend in me, never hesitate to reach out, and I look forward to continuing our friendship wherever you go. Take care.
I'm here, like all of you, to celebrate the achievements of Ron Dermer. You know, there is a theory that nowadays ambassadors don't matter. I mean, you have not only jet travel, you have not only fantastic telecommunications, we have fantastic secure telecommunications. I can pick up the phone in the White House or the State Department and get the Prime Minister's office, the Israeli embassy, or whatever in a secure call. But that theory is wrong, and Ron has proved it. He has proved how incredibly important an ambassador can be in representing his country in another capital. What do you need to be a successful ambassador? You need to speak for the Prime Minister so everyone knows, take seriously what this guy is saying. You need to understand the country where you represent your own. And of course, Ron really deeply does. And you need to have the ability to articulate the interests and the values of your country and to show how those interests and values match with those of the United States. No one has ever done a better job at that in the streets of our country, in the Congress, in the White House, in the State Department. No one has ever better represented what the people of Israel want for their future, for their security, for their prosperity, and for their friendship with the United States. So Ron, congratulations. And as an American, private citizen and official, thank you.
Ambassador Dermer, thank you for your 7 years of service as Israel's ambassador to the United States. The relationship between our two countries has always been special, based on shared values of justice, democracy, and freedom. Israel faces countless threats on a daily basis, from rockets targeting innocent civilians to terrorist networks, the risk of nuclear war, and the boycott, divestment, and sanctions BDS movement. You've navigated these challenging situations with true leadership, bolstering Israel's ability to protect her citizens from the constant peril of her hostile neighbors and adversaries. I'm proud of the work we've done together to make Israel more secure. Your fierce commitment to the safety and security of the State of Israel, along with the bipartisan support that Israel continues to earn in the United States, has allowed for remarkable successes. Democrats and Republicans are united in recognizing that both countries benefit from the unbreakable bond between our two nations. The United States Congress and the American Jewish community are grateful for your dedicated years of public service that have strengthened the U.S.-Israel relationship. It has been a privilege to work with you, and I commend your bold leadership. I'm also sending love to Rhoda, your children, and your mom. I hope to see you all in South Florida sometime soon.
Ambassador Dermer, it's been such a great honor to work with you to strengthen the alliance between our two great nations. Working together, we moved the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, withdrew from the fatally flawed Iran nuclear deal, reached this historic Abraham Accords, and so much more. The alliance between our two countries have never been stronger, and it is no coincidence that all of these huge wins happened on your watch. Ambassador Dermer, I can't thank you enough for your exceptional service and your amazing friendship.
Hi, it's Ted Deutsch, Ambassador Dermer. Ron, congratulations to you. I wanted to thank you for your service to the State of Israel, for working with me in so many ways to help strengthen and broaden and deepen the U.S.-Israel relationship, to recognize the importance of always maintaining that strong bipartisan support that continues to be the case so overwhelmingly in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. I wish you well in whatever pursuit next comes your way. I know that you'll have lots of wonderful opportunities, and I'll look forward to following your career, perhaps political, in fact, as you go forward. And I really look forward to visiting with you and your family in Israel, hopefully sometime very, very soon. Congratulations. I will talk to you soon. Thank you again, Kol HaKavod, for all of your efforts as ambassador to the United States of America. Thanks.
To Ambassador Ron Dermer, congratulations on a great record as Israel's representative here in the United States. I particularly appreciate your friendship and your candor. You should be very proud of your record. You were able to strengthen the bond between the United States and the State of Israel, strengthen the security alliance between our two great nations, and you were able to expand the number of countries in the Middle East that are normalizing their relationship with the State of Israel, which is clearly in Israel's national security interest and advances America's national security interest. I look forward to the day when it's safe again to travel, and I can meet you on the streets of Jerusalem and celebrate the friendship and security between our two great nations. Again, congratulations on a job well done. Yasher Koach.
Ileana. I have known Ron Dermer for many years, way before he was called ambassador. As a matter of fact, I knew him when he was a teenager growing up in part of my congressional district of Miami Beach. Ron will tell you himself, which makes me extremely proud, that when he became old enough to vote, the first vote he cast was for me as his member of Congress. Sweet. And as a bonus, when he relinquished his U.S. citizenship to pursue public service in Israel, his last vote as an American was also for me. Holy Toledo, what an honor. In my time as a member of Congress, I was blessed to work with Ron on a myriad of important issues related to the U.S.-Israel partnership. Ron is an exemplary diplomat who cherishes and respects the strategic and mutually beneficial relationship between our two nations. When Prime Minister Netanyahu named Ron to this post, They both knew that one of the priorities from day one would be to work to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear power. Ron has worked diligently for Jewish sovereignty that guarantees strong defense against Israel's enemies. He has been resolute and he has been a faithful voice for the survival of the Jewish state. Ambassador Dermer is an exceptional individual whose upbringing and education here in the United States has helped him to navigate the political process in Washington with grace and strength for the benefit of the bilateral U.S. Israel relationship. As his time now as Israeli ambassador to the U.S. comes to a close after 8 years, I wish you, Ron, and Rhoda, your children, and your family only the best in the next exciting chapter that will surely include your love for and selfless work on behalf of our democratic Jewish state. Mazel tov, amigo.
Well, next, we're going to have Ileana's going to share some embarrassing pictures and stories from your teenage years, Ron. But actually, maybe we don't have enough time for that. We'll save that for another day. But that's just really a small sampling of the many dignitaries from both sides of the aisle and from both sides of the ocean that would wish to express their gratitude and their admiration for you. So next up, I'd like to turn it over to William Daroff, our CEO of the Conference of Presidents. William?
Thank you very much, Arthur, and thank you everyone for joining us. It is a pleasure, Ron, to be here and for me to join in expressing my deep gratitude for your years of distinguished service as ambassador. Since 2013, you have served with distinction and dedication as Israel's representative to its greatest friend and ally, championing the interests of the Jewish state over 2 American administrations. You've worked to strengthen the special U.S.-Israel relationship, raised your voice to draw attention to the threat posed to both of our countries by Iran, and have been a key player in shepherding through an astonishing number of peace treaties between Israel and its former foes. History will remember your leading role in the Abraham Accords, which have set the stage for a new era in Israeli diplomacy and made possible a brighter future for the Middle East. You leave your post with 4 Arab countries, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, as newfound friends of Israel. The Jewish people and the Jewish state are in your debt. Your tenure will serve as a model of effective diplomacy for those that follow in your important role. On a personal note, I remember fondly our many discussions during Torah tots at our synagogue during your first stint at the embassy at the turn of the century. Our conversations and a little Scotch whiskey helped to make Torah tots bearable for me. Our relationship has flourished over the 20 years that have followed, where you have been a trusted friend and advisor for which I am truly grateful. And I send special thanks for Rhoda's influence and support for you in every facet of your role, and particularly, as Arthur noted, for your embrace of veganism. We know we have not seen the last of you, but you will dearly be missed in your capacity as ambassador. We look forward to seeing you go from strength to strength as you continue to serve the state of Israel and the Jewish people. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, William. Next up, I'd like to turn our own Malcolm online with a presentation of a gift. Malcolm?
Thank you. You know, Dorothy Parker once said, after a long line of speakers, everything has been said, but just not everybody has said it. So I will try to find something unique. I think the broad array of people that were on the video, and only a small part of those who would have wanted to participate, reflect the remarkable impact you have had on both sides of the aisle and across the board. All of them willingly and welcomed the opportunity to participate and to add their words of tribute. So I think it's a reflection of the impact that you have had over the years and the scope of the relationships and broad outreach that you established while being ambassador. But I knew you even before as well, not as long as Ileana Ross-Levitin, but I do remember your earlier years, and it's remarkable how your passion and your commitment, your spirit has remained consistent, defending Israel, explaining Israel. It's never diminished. And your commitment to Israel over the years and your unique ability to explicate Israel sometimes in very difficult circumstances and to explain policies has always gained you the respect of those with whom you have engaged. We read in this week's Parsha that Paro challenges Moses about Miva Miahochim, who's going to leave. And he, of course, says, you can take some of the old people and go. And Moses answers, Binurenus Kenenu, and that we start first with the young, then the old, and then all of the property, etc., that we're all going to go. You have made it a point to reach out to young people, to appear on campuses, to be available to all sorts of groups, ethnic and religious groups, but especially to the younger people, to help explain to them and to build support amongst them for Israel on a bipartisan basis. I think your words were always appreciated, and your availability to us and to so many others is something that we do not take for granted. You built many bridges that I think will be long lasting. And so it was a special privilege for us to call you and to ask if we could do this. We did it for us because Hakaras HaTov is a central principle in Jewish life, expressing appreciation. We are so ready to criticize, but too rarely do we take the time to express our thanks and appreciation. And especially, it's a thankless job at times, being in Jewish leadership or Israel leadership, but you have handled it with grace. And I know that there will be many more great things in your future. As we say, Chazak, Chazak v'nis chazek. Chazak, you've been strong, a strong defender, a strong voice for Israel. Chazak, that you have strengthened many, many others, v'nis chazek, and that you will be strengthened as you go back and continue to lead and engage in the efforts to make Israel's case, to build support for Israel. And a special thanks to Rhoda that was mentioned, the pride of the Beis Yaakov of Baltimore, to which my grandchildren, some of them attend, and for her support and opening your home so often for many of us. So we have a small gift for you, which is at your office, and they just presented to you. And we hope that it will be a lasting reminder. It is small, so you don't have to declare it, but that will be a reminder of the friends you've left behind, of the ongoing friendship and the future relationships that we all look forward to having with you. So on behalf of everyone at the conference, we are very grateful and wish you all the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
So now we have the, thank you, Malcolm. We now have the privilege to hear from Ambassador Dermer and Ron Dermer. And so first of all, I don't know, Ron, if you want to rebut any of the comments that have been made or if you accept them in their entirety.
Well, I'm actually very touched by it. I didn't know that you were going to do that and reach out to everybody. When Malcolm approached me about doing a farewell, I thought it would be an opportunity for us to have a conversation, kind of sum up these years. So I'm very touched that you reached out, and very touched by the words that the people I had the opportunity to work with on both sides of the aisle over the last 7 years, that they said what they said. And obviously the Prime Minister, who appointed me to this post and had the confidence that I could do this job, and gave me that confidence every step of the way. He's sort of been the coach that, we talking about football before, but the coach who chose me to be the quarterback, and he even let me call some of the plays sometimes. And I'm very grateful to him, and grateful really to all of you for the partnership, because you make the job of every Israeli ambassador to the United States easier. I saw that firsthand in the positions that you take as a conference over these years. And I will tell you that I don't take you for granted. I don't know if every Israeli knows the critical role that the conference plays, and especially when you speak together as a united force. I think then your role becomes, orders of magnitude greater. And I think you were there at some of the critical moments that we were involved in over the last 7 years, both in combating things that we thought would undermine Israel's security, and also advancing things that we thought would strengthen Israel's security and help us advance peace. And so I'm very appreciative for the partnership, and I'm appreciative to you personally, Arthur, for our friendship, and Malcolm for your kind words. William, I will just say to William, just one rebuttal, that I'm not a vegan by choice. I was forced to become a vegan by my wife. That was the deal we made when the Prime Minister wanted to extend me in 2018. She said, now that you've done negotiating with him, now the real negotiations began, and she got me on this crazy vegan diet. So it's been 2.5 years since I've haven't had a piece of meat, and I can't get it visiting William. I had one piece of fish. I went to Alaska. There's one caveat to the rule. If you catch it, you can eat it. So in the summer in Alaska, I went there in 2019 for an Arrow missile test that we had in Kodiak, Alaska. And because I caught it, I was able to lead it. So I should say that what I should do right now, William, is just go fishing, because then maybe I can get out of this thing. But it was tied to our job. So we're going to have a conversation when I go back to Jerusalem next month, whether I have to stick with this vegan thing. But I leave healthier and thinner than I came. So not that many ambassadors can say that. That's the good thing. But I appreciate it very much. And everybody, Diane, the new role that you're applying and leading the conference forward, and everybody else on this line, I'm very touched that you've all joined this and to hear those kind words. Israel's usually seen as a Firgun-free zone, we say. It's like nobody says anything nice about anybody else. So it's good that you got enough Americans on the line to say something. But all of those people, Ileana, Ted, Debbie, Senator Cardin, all of those people, they were a pleasure to work with. And also on the occasional moments that we disagreed, we never lost sight of the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship and how we want to work together to build it. And I never doubted for a second, so many people, even when they disagreed with me, that they were as committed as I was to strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I think it's a real blessing to have that. And we should not take that bipartisan support for granted and work to nurture it as much as we can in the years and decades ahead.
That's most important. So looking back on the job, there were so many highlights throughout your tenure. What would you say were the top three or so?
Top three? Well, people ask me the top one. The top one, it surprises people when I say it. It was the Prime Minister's speech to Congress for me. And the reason why is we had many great things that happened. The Abraham Accords, the recognition of Jerusalem, the Golan Heights. We had an MOU that we made with the Obama administration over military assistance over the next 10 years. So there were many things that I were involved in that were highlights, but to me, that was the most important, because all those other things relied on others. You had to do that in partnership with the United States or in partnership with other our new Arab allies in the region, that they had to make the decision. But ultimately, we have to be judged on the actions that we take. And that was, for me, the highlight, because it gave meaning to Jewish sovereignty. And for me, Jewish sovereignty, some of you have heard me say this over the years, what's different about being a Jewish community, no matter how strong a Jewish community can be or how influential a Jewish community can be, it's not the same thing as Jewish sovereignty. And that is a priceless possession that we have. And the meaning of Jewish sovereignty for me is that we have a voice, we have a refuge, and we have a shield. And I think people understand the shield with the IDF and the importance of the Jewish people having the power to defend themselves. I think people understand the refuge, which is that there's always a place that Jews can go to when they're fleeing persecution. And many Jews, since Israel's birth, has used that refuge, whether it was from Europe or from Ethiopia or for the former Soviet Union or the Middle East and North Africa. But there's also the importance of Israel having a voice, meaning not be silent, because we didn't have that 80 years ago. We had to beg other people to make our case for us. Jan Karski is the most famous Polish diplomat. If people know that story of the Polish Jews saying, go say to Roosevelt and go tell him, tell him what's going on to the Jews. And for me, to be an ambassador, one of the things you do as an ambassador is you're that voice. And you have to raise that voice at a critical time. And if you don't do it, you are derelict in your duty as an ambassador. And so when the Prime Minister, when the Prime Minister of Israel goes to the United Nations and speaks up, when he speaks in Congress, or when an ambassador has the privilege to go on CNN and or BBC or whatever, and to speak up on behalf of the Jewish people, I am always conscious of the fact that 80 years ago, the Jews didn't have a voice. And that's why when you had something like Iran, and the stakes were really so high because of the threat that we see Iran, which is a regime that openly, vows and actively works to destroy us. When we had the opportunity to speak out against the deal, even to our greatest friend and ally, the United States. And I have no doubt today, just as I had no doubt then, that many people who are on the other side of the debate thought it would actually make Israel stronger. I disagree. And I thought our role was to make our case. And I think the Prime Minister said there, the days when the Jewish people will be passive in the face of those who seek our annihilation, those days are over. And they were over. And that to me was, I think, a highlight. I also had some personal highlights. Maybe it's because, being born and raised in this country, when I spoke in Ebenezer Church, with the podium, the pew that Martin Luther King spoke at, that was certainly a highlight for me. Got to give a speech in Fulton, Missouri about Churchill in Israel, where Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech. And the last thing I'll say, which is a very special thing for an Israeli ambassador, is when you speak on Holocaust Day in the Rotunda in Washington. It's a very majestic ceremony. And that is one of the hardest speeches I have to say to give. It's only about 5 minutes, and I can barely clear my throat in less than 10. But what's difficult about it is that America's your host, and you have the soldiers coming in. I don't know, Arthur, if you've ever been there. I'm sure Malcolm or William have been at that ceremony before. You see the soldiers who were from the units who liberated those camps marching in. And it's very majestic, the ceremony. And America's your host, and I'm Israel's ambassador to the United States. But we have to remember that no one was there for the Jewish people at that critical hour. And so how do you speak the truth and do justice to the memory of the survivors at the same time when you have gratitude that your host is hosting such a ceremony in the heart of their capital? And doing that was always, I think, something very special for me as the ambassador, not just of the state of Israel, but the ambassador of the one and only Jewish state. And I've always been conscious of that kind of two hats that you have. You represent the 9+ million citizens of Israel, Jews and non-Jews alike, but you're also the ambassador of the one and only Jewish state. And as I've told people over the years, there is no, in Washington, there's like 192 ambassadors, but there's no ambassador of Babylon, and there's no ambassador of Imperial Rome, and there's no ambassador of 1,000-year Reich, but there is an ambassador of Israel. And I was always conscious of that and the privilege to be able to be Israel's voice.
That's an exciting concept. So that's on the plus side. What would you say on the other side? What were some of the most difficult aspects or moments in your time in Washington?
Well, the one time period would be around that speech, because it was of such great controversy. And if you remember that it was announced in January, it wasn't given till March. So those were a long 6 weeks. But that comes with the territory. You've got to be able to take the heat. And I believe then and do now that it was the right thing for the state of Israel. And not only did I not think it was going to rupture the U.S.-Israel alliance, I believe ultimately that people respect those who stand up for what they believe. And a country who's not willing to stand up, I think, will ultimately not be respected. One good thing that came from that speech that I was not anticipating, because for me, Arthur, you've heard me say it before, it was fulfilling a fundamental moral obligation to speak out. But one positive consequence that came from that is the impact that it had on the Arab world, which I didn't anticipate. Because for them, for many of them, and many of them reached out, a number of them that we have peace with today, reached out and told this to the prime minister right after. So I don't think he was anticipating it either as well. They saw that we spoke for them too, because we were saying publicly what they were thinking privately, but they were not willing to say at that time publicly. But for them, that speech was also Israel's declaration of independence from America. Because if we're simply a vassal of Rome, then just deal with Rome. Don't deal with a vassal. And I think Israel's willingness to take that stand convinced them that we are an independent country, that we are willing to speak out, even with our greatest of friends, and that if we're willing to speak, we ultimately will be willing to defend ourselves as well. And that accelerated, I can tell you, this is not an assessment, this is what I know. It dramatically accelerated contacts underneath the surface from 2015 that ultimately surfaced in 2020. I do not believe that we would have reached the Abraham Accords had the prime minister not shown up and made that speech. That's hard for somebody to see connecting the dots, but since I lived it, I can tell you that's what happened. That's what happened. Besides that, as a general rule, I will tell you what's hardest, frankly, for an Israeli ambassador as a constant effort is to see kind of battles within Jewish groups. That's hard because I think, whatever the battles that are going on, here the unity, internal unity is so important, and you're trying to do whatever you can to create that common ground. And when you have groups at odds with each other, I think it makes it more difficult. And frankly, when you have, I would say, not criticism of the state of Israel, because we're a country and we can be criticized like anyone else, but sometimes the flippancy with which I saw that criticism meted out. I mean, we have to recognize as Jews that 100 generations of Jews did not have the privilege to live at a time when there's a sovereign Jewish state. And 3 generations, now going on 4, have had that privilege. We got to understand what that means. This precious gift that we have inherited. And what's hardest for me as an ambassador, and I went out of my way to not respond to all of these things, because I think actually having these battles is not good for the Jewish people or for the Jewish state. But it was disheartening to see sometimes the flippancy with which people would sort of punch at Israel, because we cannot take it for granted. Don't assume it. And no matter how difficult the situation seems for us today, remember that our grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents, going back 100 generations, would have given anything to trade their problems for ours. Now, if you have that attitude, doesn't mean you're not going to be critical of Israel. Doesn't mean you're not going to agree. You're going to agree with every decision of every Israeli government. That's fine. But always keep it in perspective about the privilege we have to have a state of Israel. And with that privilege comes a responsibility, is to secure it for the next generation. And I don't think that's a responsibility that falls on the shoulders of prime ministers or ambassadors alone. I think it falls on the shoulders of every single person who considers himself a Jewish leader. What that means to me is you are doing everything you can to secure this Jewish state for the next generation. And we may have differences of opinion about the best way to do that, which is fine. But before you attack and criticize it publicly, recognize that responsibility. I think if people do that, they will be less flippant in Israel. And I think Israelis will actually listen to that criticism, and it will be, and they'll take it much more seriously than would otherwise be the case, because they'll understand the depth of the friendship of the people who are criticizing this or that policy.
I'm into that. So looking ahead, so what advice would you have both for Ambassador Erdan and for President-elect Biden about the U.S.-Israel relationship?
Well, for Gilad, who I've known for over 20 years, is a very serious person, a very responsible person, and I think he's going to do a fine job representing Israel. I told Gilad the other day, because they did a sort of farewell at the embassy for me. I said, first of all, to be yourself. I think what is admired in the United States, even when they don't agree with you, is authenticity. And if you tell people authentic and you're sincere, I think people admire it. The second thing is to not get lost in all the small stuff. Being ambassador, you can spend all your time dealing with, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. Focus on the big issues, try to get the big issues right. And if you do, a lot of the other stuff falls in line. I've been blessed to have, to work with very fine people at the embassy, both my fellow diplomats here and my, fantastic staff in the embassy that's enabled me actually to do my job. But I always try to keep focus on the big issues. And the other thing I told them is understand that what I said before, you not only represent a 72-year-old country that has 9 million citizens, you represent a people that is nearly 4,000 years old. And when you have that in mind, you don't get intimidated by walking through the halls of Rome, the modern democratic Rome, this great nation called the United States. 72-year-old country, you're dealing with this power of the United States. It can be a little bit intimidating. I was born and raised here, so maybe it's easier for me, but for people from the outside, always remember we are a 4,000-year-old people. And I think when you have that attitude, whether it's going into the White House, going into a meeting in Congress, or sitting in a chair before a CNN interview, you start to look at things a little bit differently. As for President-elect Biden, I don't think I have to tell him that much about the U.S.-Israel relationship. He has been a great supporter of the U.S.-Israel relationship for nearly 50 years of his public life. He is somebody who has always seen Israel as an asset, meaning there's always a question. Does this person, it's less so in the last few years, because the whole idea that Israel is a liability has turned into almost absurd, because the old argument why Israel was a liability is 2 reasons. It's Arabs and oil. So America's energy independent and the Arabs are moving towards peace with Israel. So that whole argument sort of has collapsed. You remember the Walt Mersheimer school, that here America was supporting Israel against its interests. against its core national interests as they understood it. And many people thought this was the opening salvo in a very big campaign. I actually think that was the last salvo of an old war that said that it doesn't advance American interest to support Israel. Now I think that view is absurd, and I think it's going to be seen as more absurd in the future as Israel really takes its place. And you've heard me say this before, Arthur, William, Malcolm, Israel's going to be the most important ally of the United States in the 21st century because of security and technology. If you think about a security partner, you think about a military that can defend itself by itself, a formidable intelligence service, a cyber capability that can deal with new threats, weapons making development capability like the Iron Dome or Arrow or Trophy system and other weapon systems. You look around the world, America's got a lot of allies. Australia, Canada, Germany, France. But it really comes down to two. It's Israel and Great Britain. And on the second thing we have is technology. As you're moving more and more into this age of innovation, where the pace of innovation is so great, Israel is, the innovation nation, not just the startup nation, the innovation nation. And in all these fields, and not just agriculture and water, which is stories that people know about Israel, but fields of the future, autonomous vehicles, cyber I mentioned, also artificial intelligence, where Israel's emerging as a power. And so of all those countries in the world, again, America has great friends. But if America had to be stranded on a desert island with only one country, Israel would be the country because of security and technology. I'm not saying that now because we had 4 years where we saw eye to eye with the outgoing administration on Iran or the best way to advance peace in the region. I said it the first time I was privileged to give a speech as a sitting Israeli ambassador on our Independence Day in 2014. I think William was there, Malcolm was there. I don't remember, Arthur, if you were there. But I said that Israel will be the most important ally in the 21st century. And of course, I'm sure people at the time thought it was ridiculous. I represent a country the size of New Jersey with 9 million people. Well, now it sounds a little less ridiculous. In 10 years, when you're doing a farewell to another ambassador, it will be obvious to people that was the case. And I've tried to focus as ambassador of building those ties. You asked me about Biden. Biden recognizes that. He has said publicly and privately, if we didn't have an Israel, we'd have to invent it. Like, he gets that Israel is an asset. And that's a big deal because now it's common. But in the past, a lot of people thought Israel was a liability. It's rare to find a single administration where you don't have at least one or two senior people in that administration that say Israel's a liability. Biden was never there, ever in that camp. And so he always sees the importance to America for having an Israel. The second thing I'd say about him, he has a deep emotional connection to Israel, which is obvious to me. And I've been in many meetings with him. It was ingrained in him as a young boy, actually from his father. Everybody mentions the Golda Meir story, which I'm sure everybody has heard and will hear in the future. But the more powerful story is when he talks about his father, Joe Biden Sr., sitting him around the table, and 10 years after the Holocaust, talking to him about the importance of having a Jewish state and what that meant for the Jewish people, and that no one was there for them. So he understands it, I think, in a very deep and fundamental way. And I think he will want to work through issues with Israel and disagreements with Israel, not publicly, but actually privately. I think that's also kind of been an MO of his. And I think he wants to ensure that the next generation has the same attitudes towards Israel as he has, and it remains that's very strong bipartisan support. That is very important to him. So he is really a friend of Israel and has been. That doesn't mean we're going to see eye to eye on every issue. And I hope people on this call understand that the United States has disagreements with other countries in the world. It doesn't mean it's a full-blown crisis in the relationship. The US has disagreements with Britain, with France, with Germany, with Japan. And it may very well be the case that on certain issues, Iran looks to be one of those issues, that Israel will have a disagreement, a pretty serious disagreement. I hope not, and we'll work that there's not a disagreement, but it might be. That doesn't mean it's a crisis in the relationship between the two countries. And what we need to do is work so that what I said about the US-Israel relationship being so important in the 21st century, the tectonic plates of security and technology that is pulling us together, that is going to continue. And there are forces now, Arthur, that one thing that seems to unite the American political spectrum is that no one is looking to send more troops to the Middle East. That connects President Obama to President Trump and soon to be President Biden. And I think that makes Israel's role more important, not less important, in terms of our security importance to the United States. And I think everybody understands that China represents a real challenge for the future, that America maintain its technological preeminence. And I think that makes Israel more important, not less important, because of the role we play in technology. So the vectors and fundamentals of this relationship are extremely strong. They are much stronger today than they were a decade ago. And I think that they will get stronger in the future. And we need to manage the disagreements that come up in a relationship in a way that is befitting of what I think is a great alliance, not only for us, but also for the United States. And I think President Biden is somebody who understands that.
So that's all very reassuring. But I guess if we look on the flip side of it, among Israel's many challenges, what would you say is the greatest challenge Israel faces?
Well, three challenges: Iran, Iran, and Iran. The prime minister said that the other day, so I'm stealing his line. But then I said to him, Mr. Prime Minister, you forgot a fourth challenge: Iran. The reason why I say that is that that's the one existential danger to Israel, a nuclear-armed Iran. We have many threats to Israel. You have it in Syria and in Lebanon, which is really proxies. You know, Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. You have issues with Gaza. But you cannot allow a regime that vows for our destruction, works for our destruction, to develop nuclear weapons. And if there were a deal that would prevent that from happening, Israel would be the first country to support it. We would go house to house, Zoom to Zoom, try to convince people to support it. The reason why Israel opposed the deal then is that that's not what the deal did. I'm sorry to say, it just didn't do it. What it did is it made the breakout of Iran to one bomb in the next decade less likely. The price of it was it virtually guaranteed breakout to a nuclear arsenal in the second decade. And as the prime minister said in Congress, a decade is a long time in the life of politics. It's a blink of an eye in the life of a nation. And in addition to not actually solving the nuclear problem for Israel, it created much greater problems by removing the sanctions and creating a tailwind for Iran to, its campaign of conquest and carnage throughout the region. So we thought it was very, very dangerous at the time. We believe, as do our Arab allies, believe that it would be a big mistake to go back into the deal. We hope that the administration will not rush into a deal. They have enormous leverage. And we hope they will reach out to us, to reach out to our Arab neighbors who see eye to eye on this issue. And we know something about that issue, Arthur. I know the British and the French and the Germans are in one place, but they're also thousands of miles away. And you ask any of the governments in the region, with the exception of Iranian proxies, are you safer today because of the decision of the United States to withdraw from the deal and put these crippling sanctions on and starve Iran of these funds, and the decision to take out Qasem Soleimani, which is the biggest terrorist in the world? Are you safer today than before? The answer is yes. Israel is safer. The Emirates are safer. Bahrain is safer. Saudi Arabia is safer with a weakened Iran. And again, we don't have a problem with the people of Iran. We have a problem with the regime. And this is the big concern I have. There are internal issues in Israel, which I think are important. Integrating the ultra-Orthodox population into Israeli society, I think, is a great challenge. The other thing, I should tell you this is another positive effect that I did not anticipate of the Abraham Accords. I mentioned about the speech. Here's something I didn't see about the Abraham Accords. I mean, I had pretty great expectations for it. You heard from Yusuf today. We have a bet, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, how many Israelis are going to go in a post-COVID world to the Emirates. The over-under on that line, for those of you in a betting mood, is 1 million. I took the over, that you're going to have more million. And I know the conference, you've been a leader as a conference in going to different places. You saw the possibilities well before a lot of other people did. So we appreciate that. And that's very good, because you've heard me talk about it for years, that there's a big iceberg underneath the surface. We just have to figure out how to surface. And that's what we did this summer, which is a long story about how it happened. But and you played a role in, I should say, strengthening that iceberg underneath the surface to enable it to ultimately come out. But here's something that I did not anticipate, I didn't even think about, is the impact the Abraham Accords would have on relations between Jews and Arabs within Israel. I didn't realize that. The founders of Israel, Ben-Gurion in particular, saw the Israeli Arabs as a bridge between Israel and the Arab world. That never happened. And it didn't happen for different reasons. But now it's actually changed. The agreements that we've made, the Abraham Accords, has changed the relationship between Jews and Arabs within Israeli society. They're going to the Gulf, they're coming back from the Gulf. And I think because we moved from a kind of cold peace with Egypt and Jordan to a peace that is not only from the top down, but from the bottom up in a commercial and financial center in the Arab world, that is changing attitudes among the Israeli Arab population. And so not only is the Abraham Accords changing relations between Israel and our Arab neighbors, it's changing actually beyond our borders. It's changing relations within our borders. And I think that's a great blessing. I'd love to tell you I saw this coming, but that I did not see coming. And occasionally, occasionally positive things happen when you have breakthroughs like this. And I hope that will continue. And we will look back at this moment in 2020, not only as the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but as really a turning point in relations between Jews of Israel, our Jewish citizens, and our Arab citizens of Israel. And I think that would be a great blessing for everybody.
I have to say you have a way of making these huge challenges seem eminently surmountable. So that's great.
That's because I remember what our grandparents and their grandparents and what they were faced with.
Good point. Keeping it in perspective. So going back to a comment you made earlier about, the divide, the difficulty of seeing Jews fighting Jews, and how would you suggest, or what would be your advice on how we as a community and as Americans maintain Israel as a bipartisan issue and also maintain the support of the next generation?
Well, that's something where you can be giving the lecture, not me, but I will tell you that it's a constant effort. First of all, people have to understand that when Israel makes its decisions, it's not about Democrats and Republicans, it's about Israel. And sometimes, the Iran thing is probably the best example of this. We didn't take our position on Iran because the president at the time was a Democrat. Had the president been a Republican, we would have taken the exact same position. It's just that created a sense where other people, not us, but other people tried to turn it into a partisan issue. It never was for us, and it wouldn't be for us. I mean, I was with the prime minister in 2002. He was a private citizen at the time. I went with him to the United States, and he spoke to 50 senators. And this was during the Bush administration. And the reason why he came to speak is, maybe some of you on the call, Malcolm for sure, but others may remember this. We launched after a year and a half of terrorism. It started with the Second Intifada in September 2000 and culminated in this massacre at a Seder in Netanya at the end of March 2002. Israel launched Operation Defensive Shield, where we had this crazy idea that the best way to fight terror is actually to fight it. So we started launching this operation. And at that point, the Bush administration, which I would categorize as very friendly towards Israel and supportive of Israel, said that Israel should immediately withdraw from those territories, immediately. Then they had another press conference, said what immediately means, now, without delay. And the prime minister of Israel came here. It was a Republican administration, and he spoke in Congress. He wasn't a sitting prime minister, it wasn't a joint meeting, but he spoke in Congress to over 50 senators. And he said why this policy was wrong, why he respected President Bush and what he was trying to achieve in the Middle East and trying to fight back terror. Let Israel, you got the right principles, let Israel fight and defend itself. And I think he must have done 30 or 40 interviews, and he spoke. That happened with a Republican administration. And it could just as easily happen with a Democratic administration. I think people have to take their partisan hats off and understand that Israel's a real country with real interests. And sometimes we have to stand up on those interests. And you're always cautious about doing so when it comes to a clash with the United States, because we have no better friend and ally in the world than the United States. We're always looking to be on the same page as the United States. And when you have differences, you always seek to resolve those differences behind the scenes, not publicly. That's another thing as well. Doesn't mean I'll let you in on a little secret, Arthur. We didn't agree with everything that the Trump administration did in our region. But many of those things we were able to work out sort of behind the scenes. That was the same case with the Obama administration. What was unique about Iran is that this was the #1 foreign policy issue of a president. That's a big deal. But it was life and death for Israel, which frankly is a bigger deal. And that's why we had to take that stand. And I can assure everybody that regardless of Republican Democrats, things that deal with the vital security interests of Israel, Israel has to take that stand. At the same time, we have to recognize that people who disagree with us are not necessarily enemies of Israel. I think we are, you want to talk about, I mentioned about being flippant. People have to understand the difference between an opponent of a policy and an enemy. And to simply cast people who oppose a policy as an enemy is very, very dangerous. And actually, I think undermines the relationship. Not once in all this hard fight that we fought over Iran did I ever think that either President Obama or the people in his administrations were enemies of the state of Israel. Not once. Not once did I think it, not once did I say it. Certainly I don't say what I don't believe. They opposed the policy and they thought this would actually, and they said it, they think this will make Israel more secure. I disagree. Guess what? I disagree with Prime Minister Sharon on the disengagement from Gaza. Do I think he's an enemy of Israel? He did more for Israel than I'll do in 10 lifetimes. But I disagree with him. And I thought it was going to be dangerous for Israel. Here too, we thought it would be dangerous. And I think the flippancy of people to attack those who disagree with him as being enemy. Israel has enemies. Iran is an enemy of Israel. Hezbollah is an enemy of Israel. Hamas is an enemy of Israel. And I think you have to be able to conduct and to your opposition in a way that is respectful of the alliance and not simply impugn the motives of the other side. So I know whatever decision that President Biden tomorrow will become president of the United States, and he said many things publicly in his team about going back into the nuclear deal with Iran, which I think will be a huge mistake. But I do not believe that the future President Biden would make such a decision thinking this will bring harm to Israel's security. That's different. And we have to recognize that different and I think conduct ourselves accordingly, and to reach out to those groups within American society that can help anchor the bipartisan nature of the alliance. And that could be an African-American population, which I spent a lot of time as ambassador reaching out to. It could be the LGBT community, and it can be everybody. We should not give up on anybody being a potential friend of Israel. We should also understand that a lot of times it's apathy. It's not hostility, it's apathy. You know, how do we engage with groups where Israel's not the most important issue? Look, there's countries around the world, I'm going to be a diplomat for once, that I don't think about attitudes towards that specific country day in and day out. And so when people are not focused on Israel, when people are not as passionate about Israel as we are, it doesn't mean that they're hostile. It means that it's not their issue. And how do you engage with those people? And how do you engage also when you're living at a time when Israel is rising as a power among nations, a security power and a technological power? I think in a recent survey, the last few years, Israel's been like the 8th most powerful country in the world, which is pretty remarkable considering our size and our population. But you have the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, you have Germany, Japan, and then Israel. That's different than the Israel of our parents and our grandparents. That was a very vulnerable country. Israel's a strong country. We can go from great strength to great vulnerability by making some mistakes, largely because, frankly, we're small. I know everybody thinks the biggest problem in the Middle East is that Israel's too big, but that's what I tell people. But the truth is our small size turns what otherwise would be small security problems into major strategic security problems. But we're a strong country. And I think I spoke about this once when I addressed the conference in New York a couple of years ago, when I got asked a question very similar to the one you're asking me now. I said, when you live in a world when power and justice are seen as buckets in the well, when those who are strong are inherently wrong, you know, when the zeitgeist is might makes wrong, that's not good for Israel. It's also not good for Jews, who are not a weak and underprivileged population anymore. We're not living 10 to a tenement on the Lower East Side, 10 families. We are a strong and influential community. You are a strong and influential community. And when you live in a world where the zeitgeist is might makes wrong, that is actually a world that is not going to be great for Israel, and it's not going to be great for Jews. And I think we as Jews have to reject that, because if we made a contribution to political ideas over the centuries, we were the people who rejected the idea that might makes right. Whether it was from pharaohs, Caesars, or a Führer, we never accepted that might makes right. But it is true as well that might does not make wrong. Might is might and right is right. And I think we have to recognize that, recognize the challenges when you have this zeitgeist, what it means for Israel and why people could see Israel in a certain way, and engage. And one thing, I know this is a short answer to a long question, but one thing I've learned in my time here as ambassador is the importance of people and the importance of relationships and how it does make a difference. You know, I was always attracted to policy because of the ideas. The battle of ideas is what always that attracted to me to begin with. And I was always interested in defending Israel's policies and defending even the very idea of Israel. But countries create interests, which create opportunities. But in order to navigate and to take advantage of those opportunities, it's with people. You got to work with people. And so that active engagement that the conference does, that reaching out to this or that official, it makes a difference. And I saw it make a difference. And I'll end with a short story about that famous debate in 2015 over the nuclear deal with Iran. So I was meeting with many members of Congress to try to convince them why they should support Israel's view. And I went to one member of Congress. He's currently in Congress, so I won't say who it is. But within about 5 minutes of giving my pitch, which usually took about a half hour, he said, "I'm with you." He said, "I'm with you. I'm going to support Israel. I'm never going to do something against Israel." So I had 25 minutes left. So, you know, unlike most Jews, occasionally I take yes for an answer. But I asked him why. And here's what he told me, and it's stuck with me. He said, because when he was a new immigrant in the United States at the age of 15, he had several friends, I guess, who were also new immigrants, and they tried to play basketball on Saturday. No one would let them use the court, except for one Jewish community. I won't say where it was. He said that Jewish community, whether it was a synagogue or a JCC, I can't remember, they let me use that court. They treated us with dignity and respect. And he told me because of that, I am always determined to stand with the Jewish people. So those of you who are in those encounters and engagements with various different people, we don't know where they're going to be in 30, 40 years. I'm sure that Jewish community, the guy was just being a mention, letting these young people use the court. But 30 years later, that same person is now a member of Congress who decided to stand with Israel because of that act of kindness. So the reason I'm telling you that story, don't underestimate the impact that an individual can have on big decisions just by doing the right thing, by doing that outreach, and by treating people with dignity and respect.
Totally. Thank you. Well, to wrap it up, I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you the question about what's next for you, because I've heard you as recently as last week say that you don't know yet, or you're not ready to say. Perhaps I did hear you say that Rhoda wants you to go out and earn a living. So I'll be the anti-Rhoda and say that if you do that, I hope you hit it big really fast and come back to helping the Jewish people, because we need you. We need your bold and unwavering advocacy, and you're really one of a kind. And I want to thank you for this hour. I want to thank you for the last 7-8 years, and for your lifetime of service to the Jewish people. And we really hope to continue to see you in that light, and really believe that the sky is the limit. So look forward to seeing you here and in Israel, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you. And now I realize what I'm going to do after speaking to William. I got to go fishing, because then I have a chance to actually get rid of my veganism. I'm going to exploit that little clause in this vegan promise. So I don't know if there's a good place to go fishing in Israel, but I'll figure it out. We'll find it. Take
Awesome.
care. Look forward to seeing you all back in Jerusalem. Not next year in Jerusalem, this year in Jerusalem. And as you've seen from watching the news, we're racing ahead with the vaccines. And hopefully Israel in March will have its entire adult population vaccinated. And we might be the safest place in the world to travel to. So hope to see you all in Jerusalem very soon.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much, Ron. All the best.
Thank you. Great, Jim.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well.